The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of Colorado as dust kicked up from the hooves of a single horse and rider. Sarah Bennett pulled the brim of her worn Stetson lower, shielding her eyes from the glare as she surveyed the massive operation spread out before her. The Silver Creek Ranch stretched as far as the eye could see, its pristine white fences and immaculate buildings speaking of wealth, success, and the kind of precision that came from generations of ranching excellence. But Sarah wasn't here to admire the view. She was here for the job that could save her future and change her life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter in Sarah's saddlebag had been folded and refolded so many times that the creases felt soft as silk between her fingers. Experienced ranch manager needed. Competitive salary. Serious inquiries only. Those few lines represented the difference. Between survival and destitution, between having a roof over her head and sleeping under the Colorado stars with winter fast approaching, Sarah Bennett had been riding for 3 days straight, pushing her faithful mare Dusty through mountain passes and across high plains to reach Silver Creek Ranch. At 26, she had more ranching experience than most men twice her age, but that experience had come at a cost. Every job had been a battle, every position a test of endurance against men who believed that cattle work was no place for a woman. Her father, Robert Bennett, had owned a modest spread outside of Denver before the economic crash of '08 took everything. They had, unlike many ranchers who viewed their daughters as future homemakers, Robert had recognized Sarah's natural talent with horses and cattle from the time she could walk. By age 12, she could rope a steer with the best of them. By 16, she was managing breeding programs and developing grazing rotations that increased their herd's productivity by 30%. When the bank foreclosed on the Bennett family ranch, Sarah's mother, Elizabeth, had moved back east to live with relatives who could provide the kind of proper life they felt a young woman deserved. They'd offered Sarah the same opportunity, a chance to attend finishing school, learn to be a lady, and marry well. The thought of trading her boots for silk slippers and her open sky for parlor walls had felt like a death sentence. Instead, Sarah had chosen to stay in Colorado, taking whatever ranch work she could find while her father tried unsuccessfully to rebuild what they'd lost. Robert Bennett had died 2 years later from a heart attack brought on by stress and overwork, leaving Sarah with nothing but her horse, her skills, and a reputation that preceded her wherever she went. The reputation was complicated. Yes, she could outwork most men when it came to cattle handling, horse training, and ranch management. But she'd also earned a name for being difficult, a woman who wouldn't accept less than fair treatment, who demanded the same respect given to male employees, and who had no patience for bosses who tried to limit her responsibilities because of her gender. Her last position had ended 3 months ago when the ranch owner's son decided that having an attractive young woman on the crew was too distracting for the other hands. Never mind that Sarah had increased their calving success rate by 15%, or that she'd saved them thousands of dollars by identifying and treating a potential disease outbreak before it could spread. The owner had apologized privately while handing her severance pay, admitting that his son's jealousy was the real issue. But Sarah knew that wouldn't matter to the next employer who heard the story. Now as she guided Dusty down the winding road that led to the Silver Creek Ranch headquarters, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of hope and dread that accompanied every job interview. The ranch was impressive, more impressive than any operation she'd worked for before. The main house was a sprawling log and stone structure that managed to look both rustic and elegant, surrounded by manicured gardens that spoke of attention to detail and unlimited resources. The barn complex was enormous, easily capable of housing 50 horses, with attached indoor arenas and what looked like a veterinary facility. Beyond the barns, she could see cattle scattered across pastures that rolled away toward the foothills, black Angus dots against the golden grass. Everything she observed told the same story. This was a serious operation run by serious people who understood that quality required investment. What worried her was the silence. Despite the obvious prosperity of Silver Creek Ranch, there was something almost too perfect about it. The fences were arrow straight, the buildings freshly painted, the equipment arranged with military precision. It was the kind of place where everything had to be done exactly right, where mistakes weren't tolerated, and where tradition probably mattered more than innovation. As Sarah approached the main barn, she could see several men working around the corrals. They moved with the easy efficiency of experienced ranch hands, but she noticed how they all seemed to pause in their work to watch her approach. Word would spread quickly that a woman had come asking about the manager position. By the time she reached the main office, everyone on the ranch would know, and most would already have formed opinions about her chances. She dismounted near a hitching post that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of oak, taking a moment to check her appearance in Dusty's polished saddle. Her jeans were clean but well worn, her boots scuffed from years of real work, and her shirt pressed despite 3 days on the trail. She'd learned long ago that first impressions mattered enormously when you were fighting stereotypes, and she'd made sure to look professional, without sacrificing the practical elements that marked her as a serious ranch hand. The main office was located in a building that connected the house to the barn complex, its windows offering views of both the working areas and the residential spaces. Sarah could see the logic in the design. Whoever ran this place wanted to keep an eye on everything that happened. She knocked on the heavy wooden door and waited, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. "Come in," called a voice that sounded younger than she'd expected. Sarah opened the door and stepped into an office that was both functional and impressive. The walls were lined with awards, photographs of prize-winning cattle, and certificates that testified to the ranch's reputation for excellence. Behind a massive desk made from what looked like reclaimed barnwood sat a man who couldn't have been much older than herself, but who carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. Marcus Crawford was nothing like what Sarah had expected. Most successful ranchers she'd met were older men, weathered by years of outdoor work and conservative in their approach to change. Marcus looked like he could have stepped out of a business magazine, tall and lean with dark hair that was professionally styled, wearing a crisp white shirt that managed to look both expensive and practical. His eyes were the deep green of Colorado pines, and they assessed her with an intelligence that was both reassuring and intimidating. "You must be here about the manager position," he said, rising from his chair with fluid grace. "I'm Marcus Crawford, owner of Silver Creek Ranch." "Sarah Bennett," she replied, stepping forward to shake his offered hand. His grip was firm without being challenging, the handshake of someone who was confident enough in his own authority that he didn't need to prove it through dominance games. "Please have a seat," Marcus said, gesturing to a leather chair that faced his desk. "I have to say, I wasn't expecting ... He paused, and Sarah could see him choosing his words carefully. "You weren't expecting a woman," she finished for him, settling into the chair with the kind of relaxed posture that suggested she was comfortable in her own skin. "I get that a lot." "I wasn't expecting someone so young," Marcus corrected, though Sarah suspected that wasn't the whole truth. Ranch management is typically a position we reserve for someone with extensive experience in large-scale operations. Sarah had prepared for this conversation, but she'd learned that the best approach was honesty rather than defensiveness. "Mr. Crawford, I've been working ranches since I was 12 years old. I've managed breeding programs, handled financial planning, supervised crews of up to 20 men, and dealt with everything from drought management to disease control. I may be young, but I've been doing this work longer than many people twice my age." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her with those penetrating green eyes. "Tell me about your last position." This was the question Sarah had been dreading. How do you explain being let go for being too distracting without sounding like you were making excuses or placing blame? "I was assistant manager at the Double R Ranch outside of Grand Junction. I worked there for 18 months, during which time we increased our calving rate, improved our breeding program success, and expanded our operations into organic beef production." "Why did you leave?" "There were personality conflicts with management," Sarah said carefully. "Different philosophies about how the ranch should be run." Marcus's expression suggested he understood there was more to the story, but he didn't press for details. Instead, he opened a folder on his desk and reviewed what Sarah assumed was her letter of application and references. "Your references are impressive," he admitted. "3 different ranch owners who describe you as exceptionally skilled, innovative, and the hardest worker they'd ever employed. But I also see gaps in your employment history." "Ranch work isn't always steady," Sarah replied. "Sometimes you finish a project and have to look for the next opportunity. Sometimes operations downsize or change focus. It's the nature of the business." What she didn't say was that the gaps often represented periods when she couldn't find anyone willing to hire a woman for anything beyond basic labor, no matter how qualified she was. Those had been lean times when she'd survived on odd jobs and the kindness of people who appreciated her skills, even if they couldn't offer permanent employment. Marcus set the folder aside and leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "Miss Bennett, I'm going to be straight with you about something. Silver Creek Ranch has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather built this place from nothing, and each generation has added to its reputation for excellence. We run 10,000 head of cattle, maintain a breeding program that produces some of the finest stock in the country, and employ 43 people year-round." Sarah nodded, wondering where this was leading. "The ranch manager position is crucial to our continued success. Whoever takes this job will be responsible for overseeing daily operations, managing our staff, making decisions that affect millions of dollars in livestock and equipment, and representing Silver Creek Ranch in our dealings with other operations throughout the region." "I understand the scope of the responsibility," Sarah said quietly. "I'm sure you do. But I have to tell you that I've never hired a woman for a management position. Not because I don't think women are capable, but because this particular job comes with challenges that go beyond traditional ranch work." There it was, the real reason for this conversation. Sarah had heard variations of this speech at 6 interviews over the past 5 years. The polite explanation of why a woman, no matter how qualified, wasn't quite right for the position. In question, "What kind of challenges?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Managing 43 employees, most of whom are men with traditional views about workplace hierarchy. Dealing with cattle buyers, feed suppliers, and equipment dealers who might not take a female manager seriously. Representing our ranch at industry events, where you'd often be the only woman in the room. These aren't insurmountable obstacles, but they are realities of the business." Sarah had faced every one of those challenges before, and she'd developed strategies for dealing with them. But she'd also learned that explaining those strategies to someone who'd already decided you couldn't handle the job was usually a waste of time. "Mr. Crawford," she said, rising from her chair, "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. If you've already decided that the job isn't appropriate for a woman, then we're both wasting our time continuing this conversation." Marcus held up a hand, stopping her before she could reach the door. "Please sit back down. I'm not dismissing you out of hand. I'm trying to make sure you understand what you'd be getting into." Sarah returned to her seat, but remained poised to leave if the conversation took the turn she expected. "The truth is," Marcus continued, "I need the best ranch manager I can find. Our previous manager retired 6 months ago, and the man I hired to replace him didn't work out. We're behind on several important projects. Our efficiency numbers are down, and I'm concerned that we're going to have problems if we don't get the right leadership in place soon. What happened to the replacement manager? He had excellent credentials on paper, but he couldn't adapt to our systems and procedures. He also had problems with some of our longest-serving employees who didn't respect his authority. Ranch management isn't just about knowing cattle and horses. It's about leadership, communication, and earning the respect of people who've been doing this work longer than you've been alive. Sarah could see the frustration in Marcus's expression, and she began to understand why he might be willing to consider an unconventional candidate. When traditional hiring approaches weren't working, smart business owners look for alternatives. Mr. Crawford, what would it take to convince you that I could handle this job? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing his options. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the tone of someone who was taking a significant risk. I'll make you a deal, Miss Bennett. I'll give you a trial period 2 weeks to prove that you can handle the responsibilities of ranch management and work effectively with our crew. If it works out, the job is yours with full authority and competitive compensation. If it doesn't work out, you'll leave with 2 weeks' pay and no hard feelings. It wasn't ideal, but it was more opportunity than Sarah had been offered anywhere else in months. What would my responsibilities be during the trial period? Everything a ranch manager would normally handle. You'd oversee daily operations, coordinate with department supervisors, manage schedules and resource allocation, and report directly to me on progress and problems. You'd also be responsible for completing a project that my previous manager started but never finished, organizing our annual cattle drive to the high pastures. The cattle drive was a significant responsibility. Moving thousands of animals across challenging terrain required careful planning, experienced personnel, and the ability to make quick decisions when problems arose. It was exactly the kind of high-visibility project that could make or break a manager's reputation. When would I start? Sarah asked. Tomorrow morning, if you're willing to accept the terms. Sarah looked out the office window at the sprawling ranch that represented everything she'd dreamed of being part of. This wasn't just a job. It was an opportunity to prove herself at the highest level of the industry. But it was also a risk. That could end in spectacular failure if she couldn't win over a crew of men who probably shared their boss's doubts about working for a woman. I accept your terms, Mr. Crawford, she said, extending her hand to seal the deal. As they shook hands for the second time, Sarah caught something in Marcus's expression that she hadn't noticed before, a mixture of hope and uncertainty that suggested he was taking this gamble as seriously as she was. Whatever had gone wrong with his previous hiring decisions, he was clearly hoping that an unconventional choice might provide the solution he needed. The next 2 weeks would determine not just Sarah's future, but whether Marcus Crawford's willingness to take a chance on her would prove to be inspired. Leadership or costly mistake. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Silver Creek Ranch bunkhouse was nothing like the rough accommodations Sarah had grown accustomed to at smaller operations. Built from local timber and stone, it featured individual rooms instead of the typical shared dormitory setup. Common area with comfortable furniture and modern amenities that spoke to Marcus Crawford's philosophy of treating his employees well. But as Sarah carried her duffel bag toward the building at dawn, she knew that comfortable lodging wouldn't make her acceptance by the crew any easier. Her room was small but well appointed, with a single bed, a sturdy desk, and a window that looked out over the horse pastures. More importantly, it had a lock on the door, a detail that would provide both privacy and security during what she expected would be a challenging 2 weeks. Sarah had learned from experience that being the only woman in a male-dominated workplace required careful attention to boundaries and personal safety. The main challenge wouldn't be the accommodations, though. It would be the men she could hear moving around in the common area, their voices carrying the kind of easy camaraderie that came from working together for years. Sarah had been through this process before, the careful evaluation, the testing, the gradual acceptance or rejection that determined whether she'd become part of the team or remain an outsider until her inevitable departure. She unpacked efficiently, hanging her few good shirts in the narrow closet and arranging her work clothes. In the dresser, everything she owned fit easily into the small space, a reminder of how unsettled her life had become over the past few years. But this trial period represented more than just another temporary job. If she could succeed at Silver Creek Ranch, she'd have the kind of position that could serve as a foundation for real stability and professional growth. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Bennett? I'm Jake Morrison, foreman here at Silver Creek. Mr. Crawford asked me to get you oriented before the morning briefing." Sarah opened the door to find a man in his 50s with the weathered face and steady demeanor of someone who'd spent decades managing ranch operations. Jake Morrison was exactly the type of foreman she'd expected to find at an operation like Silver Creek experienced, competent, and probably skeptical about taking orders from a woman half his age. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Morrison," Sarah said, extending her hand. Jake's handshake was firm but brief, the greeting of someone withholding judgment rather than expressing welcome. "Just Jake will do fine. Ready for the grand tour?" The next hour provided Sarah with her first comprehensive look at the scope of Silver Creek Ranch's operations. Jake led her through barns that housed not just horses, but sophisticated equipment for artificial insemination, embryo transfer, and genetic testing. The cattle handling facilities were state-of-the-art, designed to move animals efficiently while minimizing stress. The feed storage and mixing areas were organized with an attention to detail that maximized nutrition while controlling costs. Mr. Crawford's great-grandfather started this place with 200 acres and a dream, Jake explained as they walked between the corrals. Each generation has expanded and improved the operation. Marcus took over 5 years ago when his father passed, and he's been pushing to modernize everything while maintaining our reputation for quality. Sarah could see the evidence of that modernization everywhere. Solar panels on barn roofs, computerized feeding systems, water management technology that monitored consumption and optimized distribution. This wasn't just a ranch, it was an agricultural business that used cutting-edge methods to stay competitive in a challenging industry. "What's the crew structure like?" Sarah asked as they approached a group of men preparing horses for the day's work. 43 full-time employees, Jake replied. "I've got 5 department heads who report to me, or rather, who were reporting to me until the manager position got filled. There's Miguel Santos, who handles the horse operation, David Chun, who manages feed and nutrition, Tommy Walsh, who oversees equipment maintenance, Frank Mueller, who runs cattle operations, and Rita Martinez, who handles administration and record keeping." The mention of Rita Martinez was encouraging. At least Sarah wouldn't be the only woman in a leadership position, though she suspected the administrative role was considered more acceptable than field management. "How long have most of these people been here?" Sarah asked. "Average tenure is about 8 years. Some of the hands have been here since before Marcus took over. They're good people, but they're used to doing things a certain way. Change doesn't come easy, and some of the crew had problems with the last manager's attempts to implement new procedures." As they approached the horse corrals, Sarah could see several men working with young animals, their movements displaying the kind of skill that came from years of experience. One man in particular caught her attention, a wiry cowboy with graying hair who was working with a spirited colt, his patience and expertise evident in the way the animal responded to his guidance. "That's Roy Patterson," Jake said, following her gaze. "Been breaking horses here for 12 years. Best horseman I've ever seen, but he's got strong opinions about how things should be done." Roy looked up as they approached, his eyes taking in Sarah's appearance with the kind of assessment she'd grown accustomed to receiving from experienced ranch hands. Unlike Jake's neutral professionalism, Roy's expression suggested he'd already formed opinions about the new manager. "Roy, I'd like you to meet Sarah Bennett," Jake said. "She's going to be working with us for a while." "Ma'am," Roy said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was polite but hardly enthusiastic. "Heard you were coming to take over management duties." "I'm here to help wherever I'm needed," Sarah replied, choosing her words carefully. "I understand you've got quite a reputation as a horseman." Roy's weathered face showed a flicker of interest. "Been working with horses since before you were born, miss. Learned from my daddy, who learned from his daddy. Some things don't change much over the years." The comment contained an implicit challenge, a suggestion that experience trumped credentials and that traditional methods were superior to modern innovations. Sarah had encountered this attitude before, and she'd learned that direct confrontation usually made the situation worse. "I'd love to learn about your training methods," she said instead. "Every good horseman I've met has developed techniques that work for their specific situation. I'm always interested in expanding my knowledge." The response seemed to surprise Roy, whose defensive posture relaxed slightly. "Well, I suppose there's always something new to learn, even for old hands like me." Jake led her away before the conversation could develop further, but Sarah could feel Roy's eyes following them. First impressions were crucial in situations like this, and she hoped her approach had been more helpful than harmful. The morning briefing took place in a conference room attached to the main office, with department heads gathering around a table that displayed maps, charts, and production reports. Marcus Crawford sat at the head of the table, looking every inch the successful businessman despite his casual ranch attire. When Sarah entered the room, the conversation died and all eyes turned toward her. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Sarah Bennett, who'll be serving as ranch manager for the next 2 weeks," Marcus announced. "Sarah, you've already met Jake. Let me introduce you to the rest of the team." The introductions proceeded with professional courtesy, but Sarah could sense the underlying tension. Miguel Santos, the horse operations supervisor, was polite but reserved. David Chen, who managed feed and nutrition, seemed more interested in his production reports than in meeting the new manager. Tommy Walsh, the equipment maintenance chief, offered a friendly smile but said little. Frank Mueller, who oversaw cattle operations, shook her hand with obvious skepticism. Only Rita Martinez, the administrative supervisor, showed genuine warmth in her greeting. "Welcome to Silver Creek Ranch, Sarah. If you need anything to help you get oriented, please let me know." Marcus began the meeting by reviewing the previous day's activities and outlining priorities for the current day. Sarah listened carefully, noting the complexity of coordinating multiple departments and the level of detail required to manage an operation of this scope. Every decision had implications for efficiency, cost, and animal welfare, and she could see why ranch management required both broad knowledge and strong leadership skills. "Sarah, I'd like you to spend today observing our normal operations and getting familiar with our systems," Marcus said. "Tomorrow you can start taking a more active role in decision-making and problem-solving." It was a reasonable approach, but Sarah knew it also meant she'd be spending the day as an observer rather than a participant, a position that could reinforce the crew's perception of her as an outsider. She'd have to find ways to demonstrate her competence without overstepping the boundaries Marcus had established. The meeting concluded with individual department heads providing updates on their areas of responsibility. Sarah took notes, asking occasional questions that demonstrated her understanding of ranch operations without challenging anyone's expertise. It was a delicate balance, and she could see Marcus watching her interactions with his team. After the Patella briefing, Jake assigned her to shadow different department heads throughout the day. Her first stop was the horse operation, where Miguel Santos was overseeing the training of young animals destined for ranch work. Miguel was clearly skilled at his job, but he seemed uncomfortable explaining procedures to someone he presumably saw as a temporary supervisor. "We start colts at 2 years old," Miguel explained as they watched Roy Patterson work with a bay gelding. "Basic ground manners first, then gradually introduce saddle training. Takes about 6 months to get them ready for light ranch work." Sarah observed the process with professional interest, noting the facility's excellent equipment and the quality of the animals being trained. But she also noticed inefficiencies in the scheduling and resource allocation that could be improved with better coordination between departments. "How do you determine which horses are ready for advanced training?" she asked. Miguel seemed surprised by the specificity of the question. "Roy makes those decisions based on each animal's progress. He's got an eye for reading horses that's hard to match." Sarah nodded, making mental notes about the informal decision-making structure that seemed to rely heavily on individual expertise rather than systematic evaluation criteria. It wasn't necessarily wrong, but it could create problems if key personnel weren't available or if standards varied between different trainers. Her next stop was the feed and nutrition department, where David Chun was analyzing cattle growth rates and adjusting feeding programs. David was more forthcoming than Miguel, perhaps because his work involved data analysis and scientific methods that appealed to Sarah's systematic approach to ranch management. "We test feed quality monthly and adjust rations based on cattle performance," David explained, showing her computer screens displaying growth charts and feed conversion ratios. "The goal is maximizing weight gain while controlling costs and maintaining animal health." Sarah asked several technical questions that demonstrated her understanding of cattle nutrition and genetics, and she could see David's attitude toward her shift from polite tolerance to genuine interest. This was the kind of evidence-based management that appealed to her scientific training, and she began to see opportunities for improving efficiency through better data integration. The afternoon was spent with Frank Mueller in the cattle operations, checking on animals in various pastures, and evaluating the condition of fencing and water systems. Frank was clearly knowledgeable and experienced, but he seemed determined to test Sarah's practical skills with increasingly challenging questions about cattle behavior, disease management, and breeding strategies. "What would you do if you found cattle showing signs of respiratory illness during a drought?" Frank asked as they rode through a pasture where Black Angus cattle grazed peacefully. "First priority would be isolating affected animals to prevent spread," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Then I'd contact our veterinarian for diagnosis and treatment recommendations while ensuring adequate water and nutrition for the healthy animals. If it's environmentally related, I'd look at dust control measures and consider moving the herd to areas with better air quality." Frank nodded approvingly. "Not bad. What about breeding decisions for next season?" "That would depend on current market conditions, feed availability, and our facility capacity. I'd want to review pregnancy rates from this year's breeding program and analyze which sire lines are producing the best results before making recommendations for the next breeding season." The questions continued throughout the afternoon, covering everything from financial management to personnel issues. Sarah answered them as thoroughly as possible, drawing on her years of experience at smaller operations while acknowledging areas where Silver Creek Ranch's larger scale would require different approaches. By evening, she was exhausted, but cautiously optimistic about her progress. The crew hadn't embraced her with open arms, but they seemed to recognize that she possessed genuine knowledge and skills. More importantly, she'd identified several areas where her management approach could improve efficiency and productivity without disrupting the ranch's successful operations. Dinner was served family-style in the bunkhouse common area, with Rita Martinez joining the field crew for the evening meal. Sarah sat quietly, listening to conversations about the day's work and observing the dynamics between different personality types and experience levels. The crew clearly functioned as a cohesive team, but she could also see potential sources of conflict and inefficiency that effective management could address. "So, Miss Bennett," Roy Patterson said during a lull in the conversation, "what's your impression of our operation so far?" It was a loaded question, asked in front of the entire crew, and designed to elicit a response that would either demonstrate her competence or reveal her inexperience. Sarah had been expecting it, and she'd prepared a response that would be honest without being critical. "I'm impressed by the quality of your animals and facilities," she said. "It's clear that everyone here takes pride in their work and knows their job well. I can see why Silver Creek Ranch has the reputation it does. Any thoughts on how things might be improved?" Frank Mueller asked, his tone suggesting he expected her to either make naive suggestions or avoid the question. Entirely. Sarah took a moment to consider her response. This was an opportunity to demonstrate her analytical skills, but she also needed to avoid offending people whose cooperation she'd need during the trial period. "I've noticed a few areas where better coordination between departments might increase efficiency," she said carefully. "But I'd want to study your systems more thoroughly before making specific recommendations. Every operation has its own rhythm and requirements." It was a diplomatic answer that acknowledged the complexity of the situation without making premature judgments. Several crew members nodded approvingly, and Sarah felt like she'd passed at least the first round of testing. As the evening wound down and crew members began preparing for the next day's early start, Sarah found herself cautiously optimistic about her prospects. The first day had gone better than she'd dared to hope, and she'd managed to demonstrate competence without triggering open hostility from the crew. But she also knew that real challenges lay ahead. Tomorrow, Marcus Crawford would expect her to begin making decisions and taking responsibility for outcomes. The crew would be watching to see how she handled pressure, resolved conflicts, and adapted to unexpected problems. Most importantly, she'd have to prove that her management style could improve the ranch's performance without disrupting the culture that had made Silver Creek Ranch successful. As Sarah prepared for bed in her small room, she reflected on the progress she'd made and the obstacles she still faced. One day down, 13 to go. The real test of her abilities and Marcus Crawford's willingness to trust a woman with his family's legacy was just beginning. The emergency alarm that shattered the pre-dawn quiet at Silver Creek Ranch was something Sarah had never heard before, a harsh electronic wailing that brought every person on the property instantly awake. She was dressed and out of her room in less than 2 minutes, joining a stream of ranch hands, rushing toward the main barn where emergency lights bathed everything in harsh red illumination. "What's the situation?" she called to Jake Morrison, who was directing traffic with the calm efficiency of someone who'd handled crisis situations before. "Fire in the hay storage facility," Jake replied grimly. "Started about 20 minutes ago. Fire department's on the way, but we need to move fast to protect the livestock and prevent spread to the main barns." Sarah's mind immediately shifted into crisis management mode, assessing priorities and calculating resources. The hay storage facility contained months of winter feed for the entire operation. Its loss would be catastrophic, even if no other buildings were damaged. But the immediate danger was to the animals housed in nearby structures, particularly the prize horses in the breeding barn located less than 50 yards from the flames. "Where's Mr. Crawford?" she asked, noting his absence from the controlled chaos around them. "Denver, at a cattle buyers conference. Won't be back until tomorrow evening," Jake replied. "Leaves us to handle this ourselves." The words hung in the air with unspoken implications. Sarah had been at Silver Creek Ranch for exactly 1 day, and now she was facing the kind of emergency that could define her entire trial period. Every decision she made in the next few hours would be scrutinized, criticized and remembered long after the immediate crisis had passed. Through the smoke and confusion, she could see the fire department's trucks arriving, their sirens adding to the cacophony of sounds that filled the normally peaceful ranch. But professional firefighters would focus on controlling the blaze, protecting the ranch's operations, and animals would fall to the people who understood the complex interrelationships between different facilities and systems. "Jake, I need a status report on all livestock locations," Sarah said, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even her. "Which animals are in immediate danger, and what's our evacuation capacity?" Jake's weathered face showed a flicker of approval at her direct approach to problem solving. "Breeding barn has 12 mares and 3 stallions. Training facility has 27 young horses. Main cattle barn has about 40 head that were brought in yesterday for medical treatment." Sarah did quick mental calculations. Nearly 80 animals that would need to be moved to safety, using personnel who were already stretched thin, dealing with fire suppression efforts. But she'd learned in her years of ranch management that panic was more dangerous than the immediate threat, and that clear decision-making could turn potential disasters into manageable challenges. "Rita, I need you to coordinate with the fire chief and keep track of which areas are safe for evacuation routes," she said to Rita Martinez, who had appeared at her elbow with a clipboard and radio. "Miguel, start moving the stallions to the east pasture. They'll be easier to handle separately from the mares." Her commands came without hesitation, each one based on practical experience and logical prioritization. The crew around her responded immediately, perhaps surprised by the decisiveness of someone they'd met less than 24 hours earlier. "Roy, I need your assessment of which horses can be led and which ones will need to be trailered," she continued, addressing the veteran horseman who had questioned her credentials the previous day. Roy Patterson's expression had changed dramatically from skeptical evaluation to grudging respect. "Most of the breeding stock will lead fine, but some of the younger animals are going to spook from the smoke and noise. We'll need at least 3 trailers for the problematic ones." "Get the trailers positioned and loaded first," Sarah decided. "Once the difficult animals are secure, we can move the others on foot to temporary paddocks." What followed was 3 hours of coordinated chaos that tested every aspect of Sarah's leadership abilities and crisis management skills. While firefighters battled the blaze that had consumed the hay storage facility, the Silver Creek Ranch, crew executed a complex evacuation plan that required precise timing, clear communication, and absolute trust between people working under dangerous conditions. Sarah found herself everywhere at once, helping guide frightened horses through smoke-filled corridors, coordinating with fire department officials about water access and equipment placement, making split-second decisions about resource allocation and safety priorities. The theoretical knowledge she'd gained through years of ranch work was being tested in real-time conditions where mistakes could cost lives. The most challenging moment came when a young stallion named Thunder broke loose from his handler and bolted back toward the burning building, panicked by the sirens and smoke. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed a rope from the nearest fence post and positioned herself in the animal's path, using techniques her father had taught her for dealing with runaway horses. "Easy, boy," she called out, her voice somehow carrying above the noise and confusion. "Nobody's going to hurt you." Thunder skidded to a halt about 10 feet away, his eyes white with terror and his muscles tensed for flight. Sarah could see several crew members moving to surround the stallion, but she gestured for them to stay back. This was the kind of situation where too many people could turn a manageable problem into a deadly one. Moving with deliberate calm, Sarah approached the panicked animal, her rope held loosely but ready for use. She'd learned that horses responded to confidence and steadiness, even in chaotic situations, and that projecting authority was often more effective than using force. "That's it, Thunder," she murmured, noting that the stallion's ears had begun to pivot toward her voice. Just need to get you somewhere safe and quiet. The capture took nearly 10 minutes of patient work, with Sarah gradually closing the distance while the stallion wrestled with conflicting instincts to flee or submit. When she finally slipped the rope around his neck, several crew members actually applauded, a gesture of recognition that surprised her with its spontaneity. "Nice work, boss," Roy Patterson said as she led Thunder toward the temporary paddocks. The word boss hadn't been used sarcastically, and Sarah realized that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with the crew during the crisis. By dawn, the immediate emergency was over. The fire department had contained the blaze to the original building, preventing its spread to more critical facilities. All animals had been safely evacuated and were being housed in temporary arrangements until permanent solutions could be implemented. The hay storage facility was a total loss, but the ranch's core operations remained intact. Sarah stood in the main office, reviewing damage reports and coordinating with insurance adjusters while Rita Martinez handled the endless phone calls that followed any major incident. Her clothes were smoky and torn, her hands were scratched from handling frightened animals, and she hadn't slept in over 24 hours. But she felt more energized than she had in months. "Miss Bennett?" David Chun appeared in the doorway, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "The feed delivery truck is here for the weekly drop-off, but obviously we don't have anywhere to put it. What do you want me to tell them?" It was exactly the kind of operational problem that Sarah had been hired to solve, the everyday challenges that required quick thinking and practical solutions. She consulted the ranch map on the office wall, mentally calculating storage capacity and logistics requirements. "Have them offload into the equipment storage building temporarily," she decided. "We'll need to reorganize some machinery, but it's weather-tight and secure. Rita, can you call the insurance adjuster and find out how quickly we can get approval for emergency hay storage construction?" "Already on it," Rita replied, covering the phone with her hand. "Adjuster says we can start temporary construction immediately as long as we document everything for the claim." The next several hours involved coordinating multiple contractors, suppliers, and regulatory agencies while maintaining normal ranch operations with limited facilities. Sarah found herself dealing with problems she'd never encountered before: insurance procedures, building permits, environmental compliance issues, but she approached each challenge with the same systematic thinking that had served her in purely agricultural situations. More importantly, she noticed that the crew had begun deferring to her authority without question. Jake Morrison consulted with her before making decisions that previously would have been handled at the foreman level. Department heads brought problems to her attention instead of trying to solve them independently. Even Roy Patterson asked for her approval before implementing changes to the temporary horse housing arrangements. The shift wasn't just about crisis leadership, though. During the quiet moments between emergency tasks, Sarah had begun implementing some of the efficiency improvements she'd identified during her first day of observation. Better communication protocols between departments, streamlined reporting procedures, coordinated scheduling that eliminated resource conflicts, small changes that were already producing measurable results. "Sarah, you've got a call on line 2, Rita announced during the afternoon. Marcus Crawford calling from Denver. Sarah had been dreading this conversation. "How do you explain to a ranch owner that his hay storage facility had burned down on your second day of employment?" She picked up the phone with the kind of resignation that came from expecting the worst. "Mr. Crawford, I'm afraid I have some bad news about the ranch," she began. "I already heard," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying a tension she hadn't heard before. "Fire chief called me this morning with the initial report. Are all the animals safe?" "Yes, sir. We evacuated everyone without injuries. The facility is a total loss, but we've got temporary storage arranged and emergency reconstruction should begin tomorrow." "What about the crew? Anyone hurt during the evacuation?" "No injuries, sir." Everyone worked together to handle the situation professionally. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Sarah braced herself for criticism about procedures, insurance implications, or management failures. Instead, Marcus's next words surprised her completely. "Jake Morrison has been my foreman for 8 years," he said quietly. "I've never heard him speak about anyone the way he just spoke about you in his report. He said you handled the crisis better than managers with 20 years of experience." Sarah felt a surge of relief mixed with pride. "The crew did all the real work, Mr. Crawford. I just tried to coordinate and prioritize. That's exactly what a manager is supposed to do. How are you holding up under the pressure?" "I'm fine, sir. Ready to handle whatever comes next." "Good. Because there's going to be a lot of what comes next. Insurance adjusters, contractors, suppliers, regulatory inspections. It's going to be chaos for the next several weeks. Think you can manage that on top of normal operations?" Sarah looked out the office window at the temporary facilities that were already being organized with military precision, at the crew members who were adapting to changed circumstances without complaint, at the evidence of successful crisis management that surrounded her on all sides. "Yes, sir, I can handle it. I'll be back tomorrow evening. We'll review everything then and discuss next steps." After Marcus hung up, Sarah sat quietly for a moment, processing the events of the past 36 hours. When she'd arrived at Silver Creek Ranch, she'd been focused on proving that she could handle routine management responsibilities. The fire had thrown her into crisis leadership before she'd even learned everyone's names properly, but perhaps that had been a blessing in disguise. There was no time for gradual acceptance or careful relationship building when animals' lives were at stake and critical decisions had to be made immediately. The crew had seen her leadership capabilities under maximum stress, and their response had been overwhelmingly positive. Sarah, Rita Martinez appeared in the doorway again. "The construction crew wants to review building plans with you before they start work tomorrow. And the feed supplier needs confirmation on delivery schedules for next week. Send them in." Sarah replied, reaching for the ranch operational manuals that would help her make informed decisions about reconstruction specifications and logistics planning. "Let's get this place back to full capacity as quickly as possible." As she prepared for another round of meetings and decision-making, Sarah reflected on the irony of her situation. She'd come to Silver Creek Ranch hoping to prove that a woman could handle routine ranch management responsibilities. Instead, she'd been thrown into a crisis that had tested her leadership abilities in ways she'd never imagined. And apparently, she'd passed the test with flying colors. 3 days after the fire, Sarah discovered that someone was deliberately undermining her authority at Silver Creek Ranch. It started with small things: equipment that wasn't where it was supposed to be, schedules that somehow got misunderstood, and communication breakdowns that seemed too frequent to be coincidental. But when she found the cut fence line in the north pasture that had allowed 30 head of prize-breeding cattle to wander into dangerous terrain, she knew she was dealing with something far more serious than innocent mistakes. "This wasn't an accident," she told Jake Morrison as they examined the cleanly severed wire. "The cuts were too precise, too deliberately placed to be the result of weather or animal damage. Someone with wire cutters and knowledge of the ranch's layout had systematically weakened the fence until it failed under pressure from curious cattle." Jake's weathered face was grim as he studied the evidence. In his 8 years as foreman, he'd seen plenty of equipment failures and routine maintenance issues, but nothing like this. "You thinking what I'm thinking? That someone doesn't want me to succeed here." "Yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking." Sarah stood up from examining the cut wire, her mind racing through the implications. Sabotage meant she was dealing with an enemy among the crew, someone who was willing to endanger valuable animals to discredit her management. The timing was particularly troubling. Marcus Crawford was scheduled to return that evening for a comprehensive review of her performance. During the trial period, If he found out that cattle had been lost due to what appeared to be a security breach under her watch, her chances of permanent employment would be destroyed regardless of how well she'd handled the fire emergency. "We need to get those cattle back before Mr. Crawford returns," Sarah said, checking her watch. It was barely past dawn, which gave them perhaps 12 hours to locate and recover 30 head of cattle that could be scattered across thousands of acres of rough terrain. "I'll get a search team organized," Jake offered. "How many people do you want involved?" Sarah considered the question carefully. A large search team would be more efficient, but it would also make the sabotage situation obvious to the entire crew. Until she knew who was responsible for the fence cutting, she needed to limit the number of people who understood the full scope of the problem. "Keep it small," she decided. "You, me, Roy, and Miguel. Tell everyone else it's routine fence inspection. No need to advertise that we've got missing cattle." The search began in the pre-dawn darkness with 4 riders spreading out across the terrain beyond the damaged fence. Sarah had chosen her team carefully. Jake and Miguel were department heads whose loyalty wasn't in question, and Roy Patterson had proven himself trustworthy during the fire emergency. If there was a saboteur among the crew, it wasn't one of these men. The missing cattle had taken advantage of their unexpected freedom to explore areas they'd never accessed before. Sarah found the first group of 8 animals in a creek bottom nearly 2 miles from the ranch buildings, grazing contentedly on grass that was probably better than their usual pasture. Getting them back required patient work. These were valuable breeding animals that couldn't be rushed or stressed without risking injury or reproductive problems. "Easy, ladies," Sarah murmured as she approached the group on foot, leaving Dusty Ground tied at a safe distance. Prize cattle were often more temperamental than range animals, accustomed to careful handling and predictable routines. The key was projecting calm authority while giving them time to accept her presence. The recovery took nearly an hour, with Sarah gradually moving the animals toward a temporary holding area while Roy and Miguel positioned themselves to prevent escapes. It was skilled work that required understanding cattle psychology and reading individual animals' responses to pressure. By the time they had the first group secured, Sarah was beginning to hope that the entire situation might be manageable. The second group proved more challenging. 15 head had wandered into a canyon system that offered excellent grazing but limited escape routes. Getting them out required careful coordination between all 4 team members, with Sarah taking point position while the others provided strategic pressure from different angles. "Watch the lead cow," Roy called out as they began moving the animals toward the canyon mouth. "She's getting nervous about something." Sarah could see what Roy meant. The lead animal, a valuable Angus cow worth more than most people's annual salary, was displaying signs of stress that could trigger a stampede if not handled carefully. Her head was high, her eyes were white-rimmed, and she was making the kind of low vocalizations that often preceded panic behavior. "Everyone hold position," Sarah commanded, stopping her own advance while she assessed the situation. Something was spooking the lead cow, but it wasn't immediately obvious what the problem was. The canyon was quiet except for normal sounds whined in the rocks, water trickling over stone, the soft sounds of cattle breathing and moving. Then she saw it. A mountain lion track in the soft earth near the water source, fresh enough that the big cat was probably still in the area. The cattle had sensed the predator's presence, even if they couldn't see it directly, and their instincts were telling them to flee rather than be herded toward what might be a trap. "We've got a lion somewhere nearby," Sarah called quietly to her team. "The cattle can smell it, which is why they're refusing to move." Mountain lions were a constant threat in Colorado ranch country, but they usually avoided areas with human activity. This one was either unusually bold or protecting a kill site somewhere in the canyon system. Either way, it represented a serious danger to both cattle and riders working in confined spaces. "What's the plan?" Jake asked, his voice carrying the tension that came with dealing with apex predators in difficult terrain. Sarah considered their options. They could retreat and come back with more people and better equipment, but that would take time they didn't have. They could try to scare the lion away, but that risked triggering exactly the kind of stampede they were trying to avoid. Or they could work around the predator's presence while minimizing risk to both animals and humans. Miguel, work your way around to the south side of the canyon. If you can get above the cattle without spooking them, you might be able to provide enough pressure to get them moving. Roy, stay here and watch for signs of the lion. Jake, come with me. We're going to try a different approach. What followed was an hour of careful maneuvering that combined traditional cattle handling with wildlife management. Sarah had dealt with predators before, but never in such confined spaces with such valuable animals at stake. Every decision had to balance immediate safety against long-term consequences. The breakthrough came when Miguel spotted the mountain lion on a ledge overlooking the canyon, a magnificent female that was clearly protecting cubs hidden somewhere in the rocks. Understanding the situation changed everything. The lion wasn't hunting. She was defending her territory against perceived invaders. She's got cubs, Miguel called down from his elevated position. Probably why she's not backing down. Sarah made a quick decision that drew on her knowledge of predator behavior and cattle psychology. Instead of trying to drive the animals directly toward the canyon mouth where the lion could threaten them, she positioned her team to guide the cattle toward a side canyon that would allow them to circle around the predator's territory. It worked perfectly. Once the cattle understood they weren't being forced into direct conflict with the mountain lion, they became much more cooperative. Within 30 minutes, Sarah had the entire group moving steadily toward safety, while the big cat watched from her rocky perch with obvious relief. The third group of missing cattle proved the most difficult to locate. 7 animals had wandered farther from the ranch than Sarah had thought possible, crossing several miles of rough terrain to reach a high meadow that offered excellent grazing but was virtually inaccessible to riders on horseback. We're going to have to go on foot from here, Sarah decided, studying the steep trail that led toward the meadow. Horses can't handle that grade safely, especially if we're trying to drive cattle down it. Roy Patterson shook his head. Miss Sarah, that's awfully dangerous country for moving cattle. One slip and you could lose animals over the edge. Maybe we should come back with a helicopter or specialized equipment. We don't have time for that, Sarah replied. Mr. Crawford will be back in 4 hours, and I need these animals accounted for before he arrives. What she didn't say was that calling in helicopter support would require explanations about why the cattle were missing in the first place. Until she could identify and deal with the saboteur, she needed to handle this situation as quietly as possible. The climb to the high meadow took nearly an hour, with Sarah leading the way up a game trail that was barely wide enough for human passage. The altitude made breathing difficult, and the terrain was treacherous enough that a single misstep could result in serious injury. But when they finally reached the meadow, they found the missing cattle grazing peacefully in what amounted to bovine paradise. Getting the animals down proved even more challenging than the climb up. Cattle were naturally reluctant to descend steep grades, and these particular animals had no motivation to leave an area that provided everything they needed. Sarah had to use every technique she'd learned about cattle psychology, combined with physical positioning that would have challenged experienced mountain climbers. Take it slow, she called to her team as they began the descent. Better to spend an extra hour than to lose an animal over the edge. The process required absolute concentration and perfect timing. Each animal had to be guided individually down the most dangerous sections, with team members positioned to provide support and prevent falls. Sarah found herself doing things she'd never imagined, literally holding onto cattle tails to provide stability on narrow ledges, using her own body weight to counterbalance animals that were struggling with the descent dock by the time they reached level ground with all 7 animals safely recovered. The sun was beginning to set, and Sarah was exhausted beyond anything she'd experienced before. But they'd done it. 30 head of valuable breeding cattle were back in secure pastures, and no one except the 4-person recovery team knew about the security breach that had required their rescue. "Sarah," Jake said as they rode back toward the ranch buildings, "I've been working cattle for 23 years, and I've never seen anyone handle difficult animals in challenging terrain the way you did today. That was some piece of work." The compliment meant more to Sarah than she could express. Jake Morrison was exactly the kind of experienced cattleman whose approval she'd been trying to earn since arriving at Silver Creek Ranch. But even more importantly, she'd proven to herself that she could handle crisis situations that went far beyond normal ranch management responsibilities. As they approached the main buildings, Sarah could see lights on in Marcus Crawford's office. He'd returned from Denver while they were recovering the missing cattle, which meant she'd have to brief him on the day's events without revealing the full scope of the sabotage problem. "Jake, I need you to keep the fence-cutting information between us for now," she said quietly, "until we figure out who's responsible. I don't want word getting around that someone's deliberately trying to cause problems." "You think it's one of our people?" Jake asked, his expression troubled. "I hope not, but we can't rule it out. Someone with detailed knowledge of our operations and access to our facilities deliberately cut that fence. That narrows down the suspect list considerably." The conversation was interrupted by Marcus Crawford's appearance at the office door. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the tension in his posture and the serious expression on his face. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just about the missing cattle. "Sarah, I need to see you in my office immediately," Marcus called out. "We need to discuss some concerns that came to my attention while I was in Denver." As Sarah dismounted and walked toward what she suspected would be a difficult conversation, she realized that the fence-cutting incident might be just the beginning of her problems. Someone was working very hard to undermine her position at Silver Creek Ranch, and they'd apparently expanded their efforts beyond simple sabotage. The real question was whether Marcus Crawford would give her a chance to identify and stop the saboteur, or whether the damage had already been done to her reputation and her chances of permanent employment. Either way, she was about to find out exactly how much trust she'd earned during her brief time as ranch manager. Marcus Crawford's office felt different when Sarah entered it that evening. The comfortable leather chairs and warm wood paneling that had seemed welcoming during her initial interview now felt formal and intimidating. Marcus sat behind his desk with several manila folders spread out before him, his expression unreadable as he gestured for her to take a seat. "Sarah, we need to discuss some information I received while I was in Denver," he began without preamble. "Information that raises serious questions about your background and qualifications." Sarah's heart sank. Someone had been busy while she was dealing with the fence cutting and missing cattle, apparently spreading stories that would undermine her credibility. "What kind of information?" "I received a call yesterday from James Mitchell, owner of the Double R Ranch where you previously worked. He painted a very different picture of your tenure there than what you described in your interview." The Double R Ranch. Sarah's stomach tightened as she remembered her last conversation with Mitchell's son, Brad, whose jealousy and inappropriate behavior had ultimately cost her that position. If James Mitchell was spreading stories about her departure, they probably bore little resemblance to the truth. "Mr. Crawford, I think you should know that my departure from the Double R was complicated by. He said you were involved in gambling activities with other ranch hands." Marcus interrupted, reading from one of the folders. "That you encouraged betting on everything from horse races to cattle weights, and that money went missing from the ranch office during your employment." Sarah felt as if she'd been punched in the stomach. Not only were the accusations completely false, but they attacked her integrity in ways that would be almost impossible to disprove. Gambling and theft were exactly the kinds of charges that would destroy a ranch manager's reputation permanently. "That's absolutely untrue," she said, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her. "I never participated in any gambling activities, and I certainly never took money from the ranch office." This sounds like something Brad Mitchell would say to cover up his own behavior. Brad Mitchell? James Mitchell's son? Marcus consulted his notes again. He corroborated his father's story. Said you were angry about being passed over for a promotion and made threats about getting even with the family. The lies were so outrageous that Sarah almost laughed, except that she could see Marcus was taking them seriously. Someone had orchestrated this character assassination with careful attention to detail, creating a version of events that painted her as dishonest, vindictive, and unsuitable for any position of responsibility. "Mr. Crawford, I need you to know that Brad Mitchell was fired from the Double R Ranch 6 months after I left for embezzling funds from the horse breeding program. His father covered it up to avoid scandal, but several other employees can verify what really happened." Marcus's expression shifted slightly, suggesting that this information was news to him. "Do you have documentation to support that claim?" "I can get it. The local sheriff's department has records, even though formal charges were never filed. 3 other ranch hands witnessed Brad's behavior, and 2 of them are still working in the area." "Then why didn't you mention any of this during your interview?" It was a fair question, and Sarah had to think carefully about her answer. The truth was that she'd hoped to avoid dragging personal conflicts into professional situations, but that strategy had obviously backfired. "Because I believed my work record should speak for itself," she said finally. "And because I've learned that explaining workplace conflicts often makes you sound like you're making excuses or blaming others for your own problems." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing her explanation against the accusations he'd received. "There's more, Sarah. I also received a call from someone claiming to be a former supervisor who said you had problems with authority and were frequently insubordinate." "Who was this supposed supervisor?" The caller didn't leave a name, said. "He was concerned about Silver Creek Ranch's reputation and wanted to make sure we had all the information about your background." Anonymous accusations were even more troubling than the lies from the Mitchell family. Someone was working very hard to destroy Sarah's credibility, and they were using tactics that suggested inside knowledge of how ranch hiring decisions were made. "Mr. Crawford, in the 4 days I've been here, have you seen any evidence of gambling, theft, insubordination, or problems with authority?" "No," Marcus admitted. "In fact, your performance during the fire emergency was exceptional, and the crew seems to respect your leadership. That's why these accusations are so confusing. They're confusing because they're false. Someone is deliberately trying to undermine my position here, and I think I know who's responsible." Sarah made a quick decision to reveal the sabotage situation she'd been trying to handle discreetly. If Marcus was going to make a decision about her future based on false accusations, he needed to know about the deliberate attempts to sabotage her work. "The fence cutting this morning wasn't accidental," she said. "Someone with detailed knowledge of the ranch layout and access to our facilities deliberately weakened the fence line to make it look like I couldn't maintain basic security." Marcus leaned forward, his expression sharpening. "You're saying someone on my crew is sabotaging ranch operations?" "I'm saying someone wants me to fail badly enough that they're willing to endanger valuable animals to discredit me. The fence cuts were too precise to be accidental, and the timing right before your return for the trial evaluation was too convenient to be coincidental. Why didn't you report this immediately?" "Because I wanted to gather more evidence before making accusations, and because I was hoping to handle the situation without creating divisions among the crew." Marcus stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the main ranch facilities. In the distance, they could see lights in the bunkhouse and the normal activity of people preparing for the next day's work. One of those people was apparently working actively to destroy Sarah's career. Sarah, these are serious accusations. If someone on my crew is engaged in sabotage, I need to know who it is and why they're doing it. I have suspicions, but no proof yet. Give me a few more days, and I think I can identify the person responsible. A few more days? Your trial period ends in 3 days, and I need to make a decision about permanent employment based on your performance. Then judge me based on what you've actually observed, not on anonymous phone calls and lies from people who have reasons to discredit me. Marcus turned back toward her, and Sarah could see him struggling with competing considerations. The evidence of her competence that he'd witnessed directly versus the accusations that suggested serious character problems. "All right," he said finally. "I'll give you until the end of your trial period to resolve this situation. But Sarah, if these accusations are true, or if I find out that anyone on my crew is engaged in sabotage, there will be serious consequences." "Understood. And Mr. Crawford? You might want to consider that whoever made those anonymous calls probably knows when you travel and when you return. They've been tracking your schedule closely enough to time their sabotage efforts perfectly." The implication was clear. The saboteur was either someone with access to Marcus's calendar or someone who was being fed information by a person with that access. Either way, it suggested the problem went deeper than simple personal animosity towards Sarah. After leaving Marcus's office, Sarah walked slowly back toward the bunkhouse, her mind racing through the implications of everything that had happened. Someone was waging a sophisticated campaign to destroy her career, using tactics that suggested both intelligence and access to inside information. The question was who had both the motive and the opportunity to orchestrate such efforts. It couldn't be Jake Morrison. He'd been working alongside her during the cattle recovery and had shown nothing but support for her leadership. Roy Patterson had seemed to genuinely respect her abilities after the fire emergency. Miguel Santos was possible, but he'd risked his own safety to help with the mountain lion situation. That left several possibilities among the crew members she hadn't worked with closely, or it suggested that someone was being manipulated by outside influences. The calls to Marcus could have come from anyone with knowledge of ranch operations and hiring practices. As she approached the bunkhouse, Sarah noticed unusual activity in the common area. Instead of the normal evening routine of equipment maintenance and quiet conversation, most of the crew seemed to be gathered around someone who was speaking in urgent, low tones. The conversation stopped abruptly when Sarah appeared in the doorway, and she found herself facing a room full of men whose expressions ranged from curiosity to hostility. Someone had been spreading stories, and based on the atmosphere, they weren't favorable to her continued employment. "Evening, everyone," Sarah said calmly, refusing to be intimidated by the obvious tension. "Anything I should know about?" "Just discussing some concerns that have come up," said a voice from the back of the room. Sarah couldn't identify the speaker, but the tone was challenging and deliberately vague. "What kind of concerns?" "Concerns about management decisions and their impact on ranch operations," the same voice replied. "Some folks are wondering if changes in leadership are affecting safety and security." It was a clever approach, raising questions about her competence, without making specific accusations that could be directly challenged. Sarah realized she was facing a coordinated effort to undermine her authority with the crew, timed to coincide with the false accusations that had been made to Marcus. "If anyone has specific concerns about safety or security, I'd be happy to discuss them," she said. "Ranch management requires open communication and trust between all team members. Like the trust involved in letting cattle wander off the property." The challenge came from Frank Mueller, the cattle operations supervisor, who had seemed skeptical of her abilities from the beginning. "Are you referring to the fence failure in the north pasture?" Sarah asked, noting that Frank apparently knew about the incident, despite her efforts to keep it quiet. "I'm referring to security breaches that put valuable animals at risk," Frank replied. The kind of problems that didn't exist before recent management changes. The room was completely quiet now, with everyone waiting to see how Sarah would respond to what amounted to a direct challenge to her competence. She could feel the weight of multiple evaluations, not just from Marcus Crawford, but from every person in the room. Frank, the fence failure was the result of deliberate sabotage, not management negligence, she said clearly. Someone cut the wire intentionally, probably hoping that missing cattle would make the management look incompetent. The accusation created an immediate reaction. Several crew members looked genuinely surprised, while others exchanged glances. That suggested they'd heard rumors about sabotage. But Frank's expression didn't change, and Sarah noticed that he didn't seem shocked by the revelation. "That's a serious accusation," Frank said. "Do you have proof?" "I have evidence that the fence was cut deliberately, and I have evidence that someone has been making false accusations about my background to undermine my position here. What I don't have yet is proof of who's responsible." Sarah let her gaze move around the room, making eye contact with each person present. Most of them met her eyes directly, but a few looked away uncomfortably. One person in particular, Tommy Walsh, the equipment maintenance supervisor, seemed to be studying the floor with unusual intensity. "I want everyone to understand something," Sarah continued. "I came here to do a job, and I've been doing it to the best of my ability. If someone has problems with my management style or decisions, I'm always willing to discuss them openly and professionally. But I won't tolerate sabotage that endangers animals or puts ranch operations at risk." "And if we have concerns about management competence," Frank asked, "are those open for discussion too?" "Absolutely. What specific concerns do you have, Frank?" The directness of her response seemed to catch Frank off guard. He'd apparently expected her to become defensive or evasive, but instead she was inviting him to air his grievances publicly. "Well, there's the matter of security procedures and communication protocols," he said, sounding less confident than before. "Some of the changes you've implemented aren't consistent with how we've always done things." "Which changes specifically?" "The new reporting requirements, the equipment checkout procedures, the coordination between departments. It's creating unnecessary complications." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Those changes were designed to improve efficiency and prevent problems, like the ones we've been experiencing. But if they're creating genuine difficulties, I'm willing to modify them based on constructive input." What followed was nearly an hour of detailed discussion about ranch operations, management procedures, and crew concerns. Sarah answered every question directly, acknowledged legitimate problems, and demonstrated her willingness to adapt policies based on practical feedback. More importantly, she noticed that most of the crew seemed genuinely interested in the conversation and appreciative of her openness to their input. The hostile atmosphere that had greeted her gradually gave way to the kind of professional discussion that characterized effective teamwork. By the time the meeting ended, Sarah felt like she'd made significant progress in addressing crew concerns and rebuilding trust. But she also realized that Frank Mueller had been notably quiet during most of the discussion, offering few specific suggestions despite his initial complaints about her management. As people began dispersing to their rooms, Sarah caught sight of Tommy Walsh slipping out the back door instead of heading toward his usual quarters. Something about his furtive movement triggered her investigative instincts, and she decided to follow him discreetly. What she discovered in the equipment shed 20 minutes later would change everything about her understanding of the sabotage situation and put her in immediate physical danger from someone who had much more to lose than just a job at Silver Creek Ranch. Sarah crept through the shadows between buildings, following Tommy Walsh toward the equipment shed at the far edge of the ranch complex. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to navigate by, but also creating deep shadows that could conceal both hunter and prey. Every instinct she'd developed during years of working with dangerous animals was now focused on tracking the human predator, who might be far more dangerous than any Mountain Lion. Tommy moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going and wasn't expecting to be followed. He paused at the equipment shed door, looking around carefully before producing a key that shouldn't have been in his possession. Maintenance supervisors had access to most ranch facilities, but this particular building housed expensive machinery that was kept locked except during specific maintenance periods. Sarah positioned herself behind a feed trailer where she could observe the shed entrance while remaining hidden. Whatever Tommy was doing, it was clearly unauthorized and probably connected to the sabotage campaign that had been threatening her position. She pulled out her phone to document whatever she might discover, making sure the camera was set to record video without sound. The equipment shed was larger than it appeared from the outside, filled with tractors, hay balers, and other expensive machinery that kept Silver Creek Ranch operating efficiently. But Tommy wasn't interested in the equipment. He walked directly to a workbench in the far corner, where he began assembling what looked like communication equipment, a radio setup that was far more sophisticated than anything needed for routine ranch operations. Sarah watched through a grimy window as Tommy adjusted dials and began speaking into a microphone, his voice too low to be heard from her position. But his body language suggested urgency, and he occasionally glanced toward his watch as if working against a deadline. After about 10 minutes, he began disassembling the radio equipment and storing the components in what appeared to be a custom-built hiding place beneath the workbench. The implications were staggering. Tommy Walsh wasn't just sabotaging ranch operations, he was coordinating with outside parties using sophisticated communication equipment. This wasn't simple workplace jealousy or resistance to change. It was organized industrial espionage, or something even more serious. As Tommy prepared to leave the shed, Sarah realized she had a critical decision to make. She could confront him immediately and risk a dangerous confrontation, or she could gather more evidence and involve Marcus Crawford in whatever was really happening. But before she could decide, the choice was made for her. I wondered when someone would finally figure out what was going on. Tommy's voice came from directly behind her. He'd somehow managed to circle around the building without her noticing, and she found herself trapped between him and the feed trailer. Sarah spun around to face him, her mind racing through defensive options. Tommy Walsh looked different somehow. The affable maintenance supervisor had been replaced by someone with cold, calculating eyes and a confidence that suggested he wasn't concerned about the consequences of being discovered. "Tommy, what's this really about?" she asked, keeping her voice calm while positioning herself for either fight or flight. "Why are you sabotaging the ranch?" "Sabotage?" Tommy laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Lady, you have no idea what you've stumbled into. This isn't about your little ranch management job." "Then what is it about?" Tommy studied her for a moment, apparently making his own calculations about how to handle the situation. Silver Creek Ranch sits on one of the largest undeveloped natural gas deposits in Colorado. My employers have been working for 2 years to acquire this property, but Marcus Crawford refuses to sell. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd been assuming that the sabotage was personal, someone who didn't want a woman in a management position, or who had grievances against her specifically. Instead, she'd uncovered a corporate conspiracy to force the sale of the ranch through systematic destruction of its operations. "So you got yourself hired as a maintenance supervisor to sabotage the ranch from the inside," she said, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "And when I arrived and started improving efficiency, I became a threat to your mission." "You became a threat the moment you proved you could actually manage this place," Tommy confirmed. "My employers need Silver Creek Ranch to fail financially, so Crawford will be forced to sell a competent manager who could turn around the ranches. Profitability was never part of the plan. That's why you've been spreading lies about me to Marcus and trying to turn the crew against me. That's why you're going to have an unfortunate accident that removes you from the equation permanently. The threat was delivered so casually that it took Sarah a moment to process its implications. Tommy Walsh wasn't just planning to discredit her, he was planning to kill her. And based on his calm demeanor, this wasn't his first experience with eliminating people who threatened his mission. "You're talking about murder," she said, still hoping to find a rational way out of the situation. "I'm talking about problem solving. You're a problem that needs to be solved, and accidents happen all the time on ranches, particularly to people who work alone in dangerous situations." Sarah's mind raced through her options. Tommy was blocking her most direct escape route, and the equipment shed was far enough from the main buildings that screaming for help probably wouldn't bring assistance. But years of working with unpredictable animals had taught her that panic was more dangerous than the immediate threat. "The thing is, Tommy, I've already documented your radio equipment and photographed evidence of your sabotage activities," she lied smoothly. "If something happens to me, Marcus Crawford will know exactly where to look for answers." Tommy's confident expression wavered slightly. "You're bluffing." "Am I? Check your hiding place under the workbench tomorrow and see if anything's missing. Or better yet, explain to your employers why their sophisticated communication setup has been compromised." It was a desperate gambit, but it had the desired effect. Tommy's attention shifted momentarily toward the equipment shed, giving Sarah the opening she needed to break for safety. She sprinted toward the main ranch buildings, hoping to reach help before Tommy could catch her, or implement whatever backup plan he'd prepared for dealing with witnesses. Behind her, she could hear Tommy's pursuit, but years of ranch work had given Sarah both speed and endurance. She'd also spent enough time at Silver Creek Ranch to know every building, fence line, and potential obstacle between her current position and safety. Tommy might be dangerous, but he was operating on unfamiliar ground while she had home field. Advantage. The chase led through corrals and between barns, with Sarah using every piece of cover available to break Tommy's line of sight and confuse his pursuit. At one point, she managed to put an entire barn between them and change direction, heading toward the main house where Marcus Crawford's office lights were still visible, but Tommy had apparently anticipated her destination as Sarah rounded the corner of the last barn before reaching the house. She found herself face to face with him again. This time, he was holding a tire iron that looked capable of crushing skulls with minimal effort. "End of the line," Tommy said, raising the weapon above his head. "Should have minded your own business." The attack came with professional precision, aimed at Sarah's head with enough force to cause fatal damage. But Sarah had been expecting it, and years of working with dangerous animals had honed her reflexes to a level that saved her life. She dove to the side, feeling the tire iron whistle past her ear as she rolled away from the follow-up strike. What happened next was a brutal struggle that combined Sarah's desperation with Tommy's professional training and violence. He was stronger and more experienced in combat, but she was fighting for her life on familiar ground with the advantage of righteous fury. Every dirty trick she'd learned from dealing with aggressive bulls and stallions came into play as she fought to survive. The battle ended when Sarah managed to grab a pitchfork from beside a stall door and used it to keep Tommy at bay long enough to scream for help. Her voice carried across the quiet ranch, bringing lights on in buildings and starting the kind of commotion that meant rescue was coming. Tommy realized that his mission had failed and his cover was blown. Instead of continuing the attack, he threw the tire iron at Sarah's head and disappeared into the darkness beyond the ranch buildings. By the time Marcus Crawford and several crew members reached her position, the corporate spy had vanished into the Colorado night. "Sarah, what the hell happened?" Marcus demanded, taking in her torn clothes and the scattered evidence of violent struggle. "Tommy Walsh isn't who we thought he was," Sarah gasped, still trying to catch her breath. "He's working for a natural gas company that wants to force you to sell the ranch. He's been sabotaging operations to make the ranch financially Unsustainable. Natural gas? What are you talking about? Between gasps for air, Sarah explained everything she'd discovered, the sophisticated radio equipment, Tommy's confession about his real employers, the systematic campaign to destroy Silver Creek Ranch's profitability. Marcus listened with growing amazement and anger as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "Jake, get on the radio to the sheriff's department," Marcus ordered. "We need law enforcement out here immediately. Roy, take 3 men and search the ranch buildings. Tommy might still be on the property." "Mr. Crawford, there's something else," Sarah said as the immediate crisis began to settle into manageable chaos. "Tommy mentioned that his employers have been working on this for 2 years. That means they've probably infiltrated other aspects of the ranch's operations. We need to review personnel files and look for other planted employees." Marcus's expression was grim as the implications sank in. "You're saying Tommy Walsh might not be the only spy on my payroll?" "I'm saying a natural gas company that's willing to commit industrial sabotage and attempted murder probably has backup plans and multiple assets in place. We need to assume that everything about Silver Creek Ranch's operations has been compromised." The next several hours were a whirlwind of law enforcement interviews, security assessments, and emergency planning sessions. The sheriff's department arrived with enough personnel to conduct a thorough search of the ranch, but Tommy Walsh had apparently vanished without a trace. His quarters contained nothing personal and no indication of his real identity or employer. More disturbing was the discovery that several ranch records had been copied or tampered with, suggesting that Tommy had been gathering intelligence on Silver Creek Ranch's operations, finances, and vulnerabilities. The scope of the espionage operation was far larger than anyone had imagined. "The good news," Marcus said as dawn broke over the ranch, "is that we now understand what we've been dealing with. The bad news is that we're going to have to rebuild our entire security structure and personnel system from scratch." Sarah sat in Marcus's office, still wearing clothes torn from her fight with Tommy Walsh, reviewing lists of employees and trying to identify other potential security risks. The attempted murder had transformed her from a trial employee to a trusted partner in protecting the ranch's future. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," Marcus said quietly. "Those accusations about your background, they were obviously planted as part of the campaign to discredit you. I should have trusted my own judgment instead of letting outside influences affect my evaluation." "You had no way of knowing about the conspiracy," Sarah replied. "But Marcus, we need to talk about what this means for the ranch's future. If there really is a major natural gas deposit under Silver Creek Ranch, you're going to be facing pressure from multiple companies and possibly government agencies. This situation is far from over." Marcus looked out the window at the ranch that had been in his family for 4 generations, now revealed as the target of a sophisticated corporate conspiracy. "What do you recommend?" "I recommend that you hire the best ranch manager you can find and give her the resources she needs to protect this place," Sarah said with a tired smile. "Because whoever you hire is going to be dealing with challenges that go far beyond normal ranch operations. Are you applying for the job, Miss Bennett?" "I'm saying that your trial period is over, Mr. Crawford, and if you're willing to trust me with it, I'd like to help you fight for your family's legacy." As the sun rose over Silver Creek Ranch, Sarah Bennett realized that her 2-week trial had ended in a way she'd never anticipated. She'd proven she could manage ranch operations, handle emergencies, and lead a crew through difficult situations. But more importantly, she'd proven she was willing to risk her life to protect the place and people she'd come to care about. The question now was whether she and Marcus Crawford could build the kind of partnership needed to defend Silver Creek Ranch against enemies who had unlimited resources and no moral constraints about how they achieved their objectives. 3 weeks after Tommy Walsh's disappearance, Sarah Bennett stood in the newly constructed ranch office, reviewing security reports that would have seemed like science fiction during her first days at Silver Creek Ranch. motion sensors, encrypted communication systems, and background verification. Protocols had transformed the operation from a traditional cattle ranch into something resembling a corporate fortress. But beneath all the security measures, something else was growing, a partnership between her and Marcus Crawford that was reshaping everything about how the ranch operated. The geological survey results came back, Marcus announced, entering the office with a folder that contained information they'd both been anticipating and dreading. "You're going to want to see this." Sarah accepted the folder with the resignation of someone who'd learned that every piece of good news seemed to come with complications. The geological survey had been Marcus's idea. If Silver Creek Ranch was sitting on valuable natural gas deposits, they needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with before making decisions about the ranch's future. The numbers were staggering. Conservative estimates suggested natural gas reserves worth over $200 million lay beneath Silver Creek Ranch's pastures and grazing areas. More optimistic projections pushed the value to nearly $500 million. It was the kind of discovery that could transform their lives completely, or destroy everything they'd worked to build. So Tommy Walsh was telling the truth, Sarah sighed, studying the technical diagrams that showed gas deposit locations and extraction possibilities. No wonder his employers were willing to commit industrial sabotage to get control of this property. "The question is what we do with this information," Marcus replied, settling into the chair across from her desk. The casual familiarity of his action reflected how much their relationship had evolved since the corporate espionage revelation. They'd become true partners in managing both the ranch's daily operations and its long-term strategic challenges. "We have options," Sarah said, spreading out the geological maps on the desk between them. "We could lease drilling rights to a reputable energy company and maintain ranching operations on the surface. We could sell the entire property for enough money to buy several other ranches and never work another day in our lives. Or we could refuse all offers and continue operating as a traditional cattle ranch." Each option carried implications that extended far beyond financial considerations. Leasing drilling rights would provide enormous income, but would also bring industrial activity to ranch land that had been pristine for generations. Selling the property would solve their security problems but would mean abandoning the Crawford family legacy. Refusing all offers would maintain their way of life, but would also ensure continued pressure from corporations that had already proven willing to use violence to achieve their objectives. "There's another option," Marcus said quietly. "We could form our own energy company and develop the resources ourselves. Maintain complete control over both the ranching and extraction operations." The suggestion was bold enough to take Sarah's breath away. Neither of them had experience in energy development, and the financial requirements would be enormous. But it would also allow them to protect the ranch's environmental integrity, while benefiting from the natural gas deposits beneath their feet. That would require partners, investors, and expertise we don't currently have, Sarah pointed out. Plus regulatory approvals, environmental impact studies, and probably years of legal battles with companies that feel like they have prior claims to these resources. But it would mean we stay in control of our own destiny instead of letting other people make decisions about our land and our future. Sarah could see the appeal of Marcus's suggestion, but she could also see the enormous risks. They'd already discovered that powerful corporate interests were willing to use sabotage and violence to acquire Silver Creek Ranch. Taking those resources off the market entirely would escalate the conflict to levels they might not be able to handle. "Marcus, we need to think about this carefully," she said. "The moment we announce plans to develop these resources ourselves, we become direct competitors to some very dangerous people. Tommy Walsh wasn't working alone, and his employers aren't going to simply accept defeat and move on to other projects. So what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we need professional help. Security consultants, legal experts, energy industry specialists, people who understand corporate warfare at this level. What followed was 3 days of research and phone calls that introduced Sarah to a world she'd never imagined existed. Corporate security firms that specialized in protecting companies from industrial espionage. Legal teams that focused on energy rights and mineral extraction disputes. Consulting companies that helped ranchers and farmers navigate the complex relationships between agricultural operations and resource development. The most encouraging conversation came from Elizabeth Warren, no relation to the politician, who ran a consulting firm that specialized in helping rural landowners deal with energy companies. Elizabeth had worked with dozens of ranchers facing similar situations, and her advice was both practical and reassuring. What you're describing is more common than you might think, Elizabeth explained during their video conference call. Energy companies routinely use intimidation tactics and industrial sabotage to pressure landowners into selling mineral rights below market value. The good news is that you've documented their activities and can now take proactive steps to protect yourselves. What kind of proactive steps? Sarah asked. First, you need to understand that knowledge is power in these situations. The geological survey was smart now. You know exactly what your land is worth and can make informed decisions. Second, you need professional security to prevent further sabotage attempts. Third, you need legal representation that specializes in energy rights to protect your interests during negotiations. Are you suggesting we negotiate with the companies that tried to murder me? Sarah asked incredulously. I'm suggesting that you negotiate from a position of strength instead of allowing them to dictate terms through intimidation, Elizabeth replied. Right now, they think you're vulnerable, isolated ranchers who can be pressured into accepting unfavorable deals. Show them you're informed, protected, and represented by competent professionals, and their entire strategy changes. The advice made sense, but it also required Sarah and Marcus to operate in a world far removed from traditional ranching. Instead of focusing on cattle genetics and pasture management, they found themselves learning about mineral rights law, environmental regulations, and corporate negotiation strategies. I never thought ranch management would involve this much legal and financial complexity, Sarah admitted during one of their evening strategy sessions. I never thought I'd be running a ranch with someone who could handle legal and financial complexity this well, Marcus replied, and Sarah caught something in his tone that suggested their professional partnership was evolving into something more personal. The corporate security assessment took another week to complete, and its findings were both reassuring and disturbing. Silver Creek Ranch's new security measures were effective at preventing casual sabotage, but they wouldn't stop a determined effort by well-funded professionals. More importantly, the background checks on existing employees had revealed 2 additional people with suspicious histories and unexplained gaps in their employment records. We need to clean house, Sarah told Marcus after reviewing the security report. If we're going to move forward with any development plans, we can't have potential saboteurs embedded in our operations. How do we handle that without destroying crew morale? Very carefully. We restructure operations to move suspicious employees into positions where they can't access sensitive information or critical systems. We document everything in case we need legal protection later. And we gradually replace questionable personnel with people we've thoroughly vetted. The personnel changes took nearly a month to implement properly, but the results were immediately visible. Ranch operations became more efficient as security concerns were eliminated. Communication improved as trust was restored between management and crew. Most importantly, Sarah felt like she could focus on the job she'd been hired to do, instead of constantly watching for sabotage attempts. During this period, her relationship with Marcus continued to deepen in ways that surprised them both. Working together to protect the ranch from corporate threats had created a partnership based on mutual respect and shared challenges. But somewhere along the way, Professional cooperation had begun evolving into genuine personal affection. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" Marcus said one evening as they finished reviewing development proposals in his office. "Of course." "When this crisis started, you could have left. Found another ranch management position somewhere safer. Why did you stay and fight for Silver Creek Ranch?" Sarah considered the question carefully. The honest answer involved feelings she hadn't fully acknowledged even to herself. "Because this place became home faster than anywhere I've ever lived. Because the people here became family. And because you trusted me with something that mattered to you more than money or safety. It's not just the ranch I trust you with," Marcus said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither had been ready to acknowledge during the crisis period. But with the immediate threats neutralized and the ranch's future becoming more secure, other possibilities were emerging. "Marcus, we should probably talk about what's happening between us," Sarah said, her heart beating faster than professional. "Conversations usually required. I know we should. But I also know that mixing business with personal relationships can be complicated. Everything about our situation is complicated. The question is whether we're willing to figure it out together." Before Marcus could answer, they were interrupted by Rita Martinez knocking on the office door. "Sarah, Marcus, sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this immediately." Rita handed them a legal document that had arrived by overnight courier, a formal offer to purchase Silver Creek Ranch for 3 times its assessed value, with closing to take place within 30 days. The offer came from a company called Mountain West Development, and it included language suggesting that declining the offer would result in alternative acquisition strategies. "It's a threat," Sarah said immediately. "They're giving us 1 month to accept their terms, or they'll escalate their pressure tactics." "Who are Mountain West Development?" Marcus asked. "Almost certainly a front company for the natural gas interests that employed Tommy Walsh," Sarah replied. "They're making one last attempt to acquire the property through financial pressure before moving to more aggressive tactics." "What kind of more aggressive tactics?" Sarah looked at the legal document again, noting the expensive legal letterhead and the carefully worded threats hidden in corporate language. "The kind that we're going to need all our new security measures and professional support to handle." As they prepared to reject the purchase offer and officially declare war against corporate interests worth billions of dollars, Sarah realized that her trial period at Silver Creek Ranch had evolved into something far beyond anything she'd originally imagined. She wasn't just managing a cattle ranch anymore. She was helping to fight for a way of life that powerful companies wanted to destroy. But she was also building something new with Marcus Crawford, something that combined professional partnership with personal affection and shared commitment to principles that transcended individual success. Whether they could protect that while fighting corporate enemies remained to be seen. But Sarah knew she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The woman who'd arrived at Silver Creek Ranch hoping for 2 weeks of employment had become someone willing to stake her life, her career, and her heart on defending the place and people she'd learned to love. 6 months after rejecting Mountain West Development's purchase offer, Sarah Bennett stood in the Silver Creek Ranch conference room, facing a table full of corporate executives who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. The room itself had been transformed since her early days at the ranch. What had once been a simple office now featured sophisticated communication equipment, legal documents covering every surface, and the kind of professional atmosphere that belonged in a Fortune 500 boardroom rather than a Colorado cattle operation. "Gentlemen, ladies," Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned her position through combat rather than credentials. "I believe you called this meeting to discuss terms for accessing natural gas deposits beneath Silver Creek Ranch property." The lead negotiator from Mountain West Development, a sharp-faced man named Richard Kellerman, adjusted his tie nervously before responding. "Ms. Bennett, we're prepared to offer very generous terms for mineral rights, leasing, Our geological surveys indicate significant value beneath your property. Sarah exchanged a glance with Marcus, who was sitting beside her with the relaxed confidence of someone watching his opponents, realized they'd been outmaneuvered from the beginning. The past 6 months had been a masterclass in corporate warfare, with Sarah and Marcus learning to fight billion-dollar companies using intelligence, legal expertise, and strategic alliances that had transformed them from vulnerable targets into formidable adversaries. Mr. Kellerman, before we discuss terms, I think we should address some history between our organizations, Sarah said, sliding a thick folder across the table. Specifically, the industrial sabotage, attempted murder, and various other criminal activities your company has engaged in while trying to force us to sell this property. Kellerman's face went pale as he opened the folder and saw photographs of Tommy Walsh, documented evidence of sabotage activities, and legal affidavits from multiple witnesses. Ms. Bennett, Mountain West Development has no knowledge of any criminal activities. If you're suggesting, I'm not suggesting anything, Sarah interrupted smoothly. I'm presenting documented evidence that will be turned over to federal prosecutors. If we can't reach an amicable agreement today, the transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Corporate executives who'd arrived expecting to negotiate with vulnerable ranchers suddenly realized they were dealing with professionals who had been building a legal case for months. The power dynamic that had favored Mountain West Development throughout the conflict had shifted decisively in favor of Silver Creek Ranch. Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious but not hostile. Here's what we're prepared to offer, Mr. Kellerman, a joint development partnership that gives your company access to 30% of the natural gas deposits while maintaining Silver Creek Ranch's control over all surface operations and environmental protection measures. 30%? Kellerman sputtered. Our initial surveys indicate these deposits are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. 30% is hardly. 30% of something is better than 100% of nothing, Sarah pointed out, which is what your company will receive if you continue pursuing illegal acquisition methods. The negotiations that followed were the most intense business discussions Sarah had ever participated in, covering everything from environmental protection standards to profit-sharing arrangements to legal immunity agreements. But throughout the complex back and forth, she felt a growing sense of pride in how far she'd come since arriving at Silver Creek Ranch. With nothing but hope and determination. She was no longer the desperate woman looking for any job that would provide basic survival. She'd become a business leader capable of negotiating with corporate executives worth billions of dollars while protecting the interests of people and places she cared about. More importantly, she'd done it without sacrificing her integrity or abandoning the values that had brought her to ranching in the first place. We have a deal, Kellerman announced finally after 3 hours of detailed negotiations. Joint development partnership, environmental protection guarantees, and legal settlement of all previous disputes. As the Mountain West Development team prepared to leave, Sarah caught Kellerman's attention one final time. Mr. Kellerman, I want to make sure you understand something. Silver Creek Ranch isn't just a business opportunity or a source of natural gas deposits. It's home to people who will fight to protect it. If your company honors the agreement we've signed today, you'll find us to be excellent partners. If you violate that agreement, we understand perfectly, Ms. Bennett, Kellerman replied, his tone carrying genuine respect rather than the condescension that had characterized his earlier comments. You've made your capabilities very clear. After the corporate representatives left, Sarah and Marcus sat quietly in the conference room, processing what they'd accomplished. The joint development partnership would provide enough income to make Silver Creek Ranch one of the most profitable operations in Colorado while maintaining its character as a working cattle ranch. More importantly, they'd proven that traditional agricultural operations could successfully defend themselves against corporate predators when they had the right combination of intelligence, preparation, and determination. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," Marcus said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "What's that?" "When I first hired you for the trial period, I thought I was taking a chance on someone who might be able to help with routine ranch management. I never imagined I was hiring someone who could handle corporate espionage, negotiate multi-million-dollar business deals, and fight off armed saboteurs." Sarah smiled, remembering her own initial expectations about the job. "When I first arrived here, I thought I was applying for a ranch management position that might last 2 weeks if I was lucky. I never imagined I was walking into a situation that would require me to become a combination rancher, security expert, and business executive. Any regrets about how complicated things became?" Sarah looked around the conference room where they'd just concluded negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, then out the window at cattle grazing peacefully in pastures that would soon host some of the most advanced natural gas extraction operations in the country. Everything had changed since her first day at Silver Creek Ranch, but the core values that made the place special had been preserved and protected. "Only that it took so long for us to have this conversation," she replied, meeting his eyes directly. Marcus stood up and walked around the table until he was close enough to take her hands in his. "Sarah Bennett, you've proven you can handle anything this ranch or this industry can throw at you. You've earned the respect of every person who works here, outmaneuvered corporations worth billions of dollars, and turned Silver Creek Ranch into something even more successful than my great-grandfather ever imagined." "Marcus Crawford, what are you trying to say?" "I'm trying to say that I love you, and I want to know if you'd be interested in making our partnership permanent in every possible way." The proposal wasn't entirely unexpected there. Relationship had been moving in this direction for months, but it still took Sarah's breath away. She'd spent years moving from job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to build the kind of deep connections that made life meaningful. Now she was being offered not just permanent employment, but a permanent place in a family and a future that she'd helped build and protect. "Yes," she said simply, "to all of it. The partnership, the future, the love, the whole complicated, beautiful mess we've created together." The wedding took place 3 months later in the same meadow where Sarah had first proven her capabilities during the cattle recovery operation. But instead of the small ceremony she'd originally envisioned, the event had evolved into something resembling a celebration of victory over corporate enemies and the establishment of a new kind of agricultural operation. Jake Morrison served as Marcus's best man, his weathered face beaming with pride as he watched his boss marry the woman who'd earned the crew's respect through competence and courage rather than traditional credentials. Roy Patterson, the veteran horseman who'd initially questioned Sarah's abilities, walked her down the aisle with the dignity of someone performing a sacred duty for family. Rita Martinez coordinated the entire event with the same efficiency she'd brought to managing ranch operations during crisis periods. Miguel Santos provided horses for the wedding party, magnificent animals that had been trained using methods Sarah had helped develop. Even David Chen, the nutrition specialist, contributed by ensuring that the wedding feast featured beef from Silver Creek Ranch, cattle that had benefited from his advanced feeding programs. The guest list included not just ranch employees and local neighbors, but also the security consultants, legal experts, and business advisors who had helped transform Sarah and Marcus from vulnerable targets into successful corporate partners. Elizabeth Warren, the consulting expert who'd guided their strategic planning, served as Sarah's matron of honor, joking that she'd never seen clients evolve from defensive tactics to offensive strategies with such impressive results. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced during the reception dinner, "I'd like to propose a toast to my wife, Sarah Crawford, who has proven that the best ranch managers are the ones who can handle anything from mountain lions to corporate executives with equal skill and determination. And I'd like to propose a toast to my husband, Marcus Crawford, Sarah replied. Who had the wisdom to give a woman a chance to prove herself, and the courage to stand beside her when that proof required fighting enemies neither of us had imagined when we first shook hands? As the celebration continued into the evening, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd arrived at Silver Creek Ranch as a desperate job seeker, hoping for 2 weeks of employment. She was leaving the wedding reception as a successful business owner, corporate executive, and ranch manager whose story would probably be told in agricultural colleges for decades to come. But more importantly, she'd found something that had eluded her throughout years of searching, a place where her skills were valued, her contributions were recognized, and her heart was home. She'd proven that women could succeed in male-dominated industries when given the opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities. And she'd helped establish that traditional agricultural operations could compete successfully with corporate interests when they combined heritage wisdom with modern strategic thinking. The moon was rising over the Colorado mountains as Sarah and Marcus prepared to leave their wedding reception for a honeymoon that would combine business meetings in Denver with romantic getaways in mountain resorts. Tomorrow, they'd return to the complex challenges of managing both a working cattle ranch and a joint venture natural gas operation. They'd continue dealing with corporate partners, regulatory agencies, environmental groups, and all the other stakeholders involved in modern agricultural business. But tonight, they were simply two people who'd found love while building something worth fighting for, a ranch that honored the past while embracing the future, a business that generated prosperity while protecting principles, and a partnership that proved the best relationships were built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and the willingness to trust each other with everything that mattered. As they drove away from Silver Creek Ranch toward their new life together, Sarah looked back one final time at the place that had transformed her from a wandering ranch hand into a successful businesswoman, corporate executive, and beloved wife. The lights in the ranch buildings glowed like beacons against the darkness, testament to the fact that some dreams were worth fighting for, and some partnerships were strong enough to overcome any obstacle. The woman who'd once been told, "I don't hire cowgirls," had become the star rancher, successful executive, and cherished wife who proved that the best way to change the world was to excel so thoroughly that doubters became believers, enemies became partners, and impossible dreams became beautiful reality. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from U.S.